all I could think about when I got a look at the place from the outside was what fun it would be to stand out there and watch it burn down. You're listening to the AMI Audiobook Review. I'm Jacob Shamansky with Ramya Amuthan. Ramya, what is this quote you had me read?
This is from Haunting of Hill House. Okay, this is written by Shirley Jackson. Probably most of us are thinking of Haunting of Hill House, the show, Netflix original, but it is based on a book, FYI. And anyways, I went off the show. It is October. We are talking a lot more spooky stuff. We did it last week with our Sela friends. And this quote particularly stuck out to me because it just puts me in that place. Have you ever read Little Fires Everywhere by Celeste Ng?
No.
Oh, God, such a good book. And the thing is, the characters that we pan on and off of, these characters that we get firsthand narratives from throughout the book, it's a multi-perspective book, you get so much of this. They are someone on the outside, someone that everybody thinks they know, but they're someone so much more sinister, more complicated, more confused, more flawed on the inside. So you get a lot of these lines where you're getting reality checks of, what could go wrong? And the capacity of something going wrong is real, but we are the only ones who know that, the reader. And others who are just kind of milling about their daily lives may not even understand what's to happen. So we're building this environment of fear that others are not even aware of, right? And it's quite sinister.
That's always exciting as a reader when you're in a position where you know information that nobody else in the story does.
Yes.
And that builds so much tension because you're in the know where everybody else isn't.
Yes.
I love that.
Yes. And you're, slowly connecting the dots with the others, right? Like thinking, okay, are they going to find out now? When are they going to find out? Do they have an inkling of what's happening? And Little Fires Everywhere, quite literally is about setting the place on fire. So that's why this reminded me of that.
So what is the context of this quote, if you can remember?
No idea.
No idea?
No idea.
Because you seem to find it pretty funny that I read it deadpan.
I mean, yeah.
What were you expecting?
It's because you're talking about setting a place on fire and you're like, can't wait.
Wouldn't that be nice?
Terrifying. Hey, we want to let you know that on today's episode, we're talking to communication specialist at AMI, Greg David. He is our distinguished guest this week. Wow, Jacob, nice copy. Mm-hmm. And he's an avid reader. He's going to be put to his paces when we do rapid fire reviews. Better be nervous, Greg. It's very scary stuff. But also, you and I are going to take some time to present our own book recommendations because we haven't actually done this yet formally since you came on the show.
No, I think we need to indulge in this because I love recommending books, but especially having people read books that I've recommended to them because selfishly, I want to talk about them with people.
Yes.
Right. So we're going to give you recommendations that we've decided to tidily organize in 2 different categories. We're going to get to more categories in the next episode. Mm-hmm. But we're going to start with thrillers and mysteries and finishing off with nonfiction. All right.
Okay.
Rams, you start. What is your recommendation for thriller/mystery?
Okay. For thriller/mystery, The Girl in the Train, Paula Hawkins, recent read for me. I will caveat this by saying I don't read a lot of mystery. Oftentimes, I won't even pick up a mystery recommendation. Like if people are like, oh, this is amazing. This is such a good read. You got to read it. What is it? Mystery? No, thanks. I don't know what it is. Maybe I just don't enjoy the process of being dragged along on an investigation. Just give me the facts. Just tell me who did it. And then let's move on to some more interesting, deeper discussions. No idea. But I did enjoy this because it was a psych thriller. Like we got to know so much of the characters' brain capacity. There was a lot of point of views as well, which I really enjoyed. So you're getting the same plot, but from multiple perspectives.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, you're getting filled in as you go, but from all different angles of the puzzle. So it felt very three-dimensional, right? Not just one character taking you along on mystery or an investigation or whatever. And the other thing that I enjoyed was there were deliberate holes. So the example of this is one of the characters didn't know what she didn't know because she was blackout drunk half the time. And her alcoholism was a big problem in the book because she couldn't remember. And half the time she was like, I can't remember. What is it? What is it? So it's not even that we don't know what happened because we're trying to figure it out. It's that we're trying to encourage her to remember what the hell happened.
That sounds kind of frustrating.
Yes. Her memory is 90% of the problem, or lack thereof, I guess. And that's what I enjoyed so much. And, you know, it sounds like it could be tedious. I understand that when I'm telling you this, you're like, okay, but how long are you going to pull that thread, right? But the author, Paula Hawkins, did an incredible job, at least to me, while at the pace of which I was reading it, to stop that when it needed to be stopped. Like as soon as I started feeling like, okay, come on, there's no way you're going to drag this on any longer, she stopped it as well. So
dragged it on, but not to the point where it became a drag to read.
Yeah, it became like a crutch for the kind of book it is. So anyways, this great read. Also, I believe it was a miniseries or a movie.
Oh, okay.
It's a TV thing as well. But Girl on the Train. What's your mystery?
I will say that thrillers and mysteries do translate well to TV adaptations.
Yes.
My choice for this category is Murder on the Orient Express by Agatha Christie.
Classic as well?
There's that word again. But I'm going to call it a classic.
It is.
This one is absolutely one of those books that drags you into the investigation. It really pushes you to solve it. Like that's specifically what it's all about. This one takes place entirely on a train, and there's a murder, as you might expect. And one of the passengers who just happens to be an investigator, has to figure out who did the murder. It's a very simple premise, brilliantly written, and one of those mysteries where it was right in front of you the whole time, and you should have seen it coming, and when you find it out, it's so satisfying. And side note, this train travels from Istanbul, Turkey to France, Paris. That's like a week-long overnight train.
Yeah.
That's kind of a vibe. The first time I read this book, I
you're
was
like, I kinda
on
wanna be
a
there.
train. Yeah, I want to be there minus the murder.
Right. Okay, I want to say that this is... Amr, sorry if I'm misquoting you, but it's one of his least favorite books that he's tried to read, Amr Khan, who will join us next week. He's read it, I believe, in full. It's not like some of the other books where he's tried again, but has not enjoyed it. Can you try to relate to someone who did not enjoy the book and understand why?
Oh, that's a great question. But why did you not like it? Is it...
I'm asking you. Why
is he
would
just
he
not? Maybe
have
it's
liked
because he wasn't into mysteries. This is very much a personal preference thing.
Is it because also I think about books like that are done this way where because Girl on the Train, hey, we have a parallel with our recommendations. Girl on the Train as well. So much of it takes place in the train. And is that just not exciting enough for people? Because you have to be interested in something other than setting. Like so much of it is condensed into this setting, which can be a vibe, but it also could be like irritating, right? Because you're not moving anywhere.
In books like this, I think it's all about the characters. But there's barely even a story, actually.
Exactly.
It's really about you finding out what happened. Like they do sit-down interviews between the investigator, who is the main character in this book, but he's really like a placeholder for the reader.
Right.
Like the main character has no personality. He literally just is there and has a name. So he does interviews with all the different characters on the train, and that takes up most of the book's page count. It's just interviews, and you slowly piece together the different relations that all these characters have to each other. And I don't know, it's a bit tedious, but if you don't care to find out what actually happened, like, I don't know, it couldn't be for you.
There's so much. I think we've talked about this before. It was Sarah Hillis, who talked about she doesn't want to try to predict. She doesn't want to hypothesize. She wants to just be taken on the journey. Like, tell me what's happening and I'll follow you on this river. But I don't want to sit there and think, oh, you did it. No, you did it. Oh, I think that I was wrong about this because da-da-da. And there's something to be said about that mindset and picking up mysteries and thrillers to begin with, right? Because I also don't want to hypothesize. I don't want to sit there and investigate with you. I just want to be taken on with the book. And that might be one of the biggest reasons why I don't pick up mysteries. You're almost needed. You need to start investigating yourself.
Yeah, that's
too much
true.
work.
Especially in this book where like I think half the enjoyment is from trying to figure it out yourself. But I think the vast majority of people, especially people who read a lot, can't help but try to hypothesize. Like,
are you
how do
sure?
you actively not hypothesize about what's going to happen?
You just don't.
But
you enjoy the writing.
If you read a lot, then you kind of understand narrative structure and you've seen all these plots happen before in other books.
True.
Right? Anyways, let's move on.
Yeah, okay. All right, yeah, we're going into something else altogether.
The next category is
nonfiction.
Ramya?
You want me to go first? Okay. I have a few. After Steve by Trip Mickle. This was a really, really, really good book. So we're talking about the fall of Apple, the rise again of Apple. And true, this was a recommendation for a book club. But the reason why I was very intensely curious about it was because I'm an Apple fan. I was also an Apple convert. I went from being anti-Apple everything to all Apple everything. So
because of this book?
No, before this book.
Oh, okay.
Good clarification.
I was like, what were you reading? A pamphlet?
Oh, stop. But this is more about Apple as an entity, right? And Steve Jobs is the one who created and just completely, brought this entity to where it was. But when he died, it went through major, major, major shifts. So what I loved about this book and what I loved about this journalistic aspect of this book is it was written to showcase the people who were part of the rise and fall of Apple, rise and fall and rise again of Apple, but in the sense of like where they were personally in relation to where the company was. So much of, the engineers and the creatives and the infrastructural changes of Apple, like the Apple Park or whatever that was being built, had to do with where people were in their own personal lives and personal investments into Apple. And some people left the company, some people came to it, some people were dragged out. And Trip Mickle just did such a good job because we just think of Apple as this big, giant tech corporation. They own everything and they have all their money. But all the people who were involved in that in such main ways had very crucial roles, but those roles were identified or manipulated or, just things would happen to the company based on where they were in life. And health issues came up, like all kinds of things came up and
like
affecting relationships. Mental health, for example. Like to run a corporation like this, it takes a lot of sacrifice, self-sacrifice. And not everyone was able to offer that. And then they would just be booted out of the company as long as Steve Jobs was in power. But that's not always the case, right? And then also, if you were, who's the current CEO? Then I'm blanking on his name.
Tim Cook?
Tim Cook, yes.
Or Tim Apple, like Donald Trump would say.
Tim Cook. When he was going through, coming out, when he was going through that journey, there was a lot of, how is this going to affect the company? And what could he do to almost market himself to the company because he knew the kind of power it would have. So there was just a lot of this exploration. But again, it's not just the facts, right? It's the exploration of the people to then relate it back to Apple. And I thought it was just done so brilliantly. Also, didn't get to a lot of the nitty-gritty stuff, that you could just find anywhere else. Interviews, facts about the company, stats, history, changes. All that stuff was really second to the people.
So it sounds like a really interesting exploration of the people behind the innovations that Apple brought, right? Because there's people behind all of these changes that Apple brought to the industry.
And the mistakes and the errors that the company had to deal with. All the above, the successes and the failures, but it was really, really about the people and the accountability and the mental health. It was just, brilliantly written.
That sounds amazing.
Stephen Scott, by the way, was the one who recommended this book. So
he would recommend that book.
Yeah, exactly.
Stephen Scott is the host of Double Tap, which you should listen to on AMI.
Yeah. Your nonfiction recommendation?
My nonfiction recommendation is The Hidden Life of Trees by Peter Wolleben. The actual full name of this book is The Hidden Life of Trees, What They Feel, How They Communicate, Discoveries from a Secret World. That's a terrible title. Just keep it to The Hidden Life of Trees. Who came up with this?
Like, would you pick this up did you just pick it up cold?
Yeah, I picked this up. I literally looked up like top 10 list of new nonfiction, and this was on the list. I'm like, okay, cool. Okay. I'm into biology and stuff. Right. I'll read this.
But I'm saying, like, if you just saw the title, you'd be like, next.
I think most people willingly choose to shorten it because there's like the short title and the long title, but they put the long title everywhere. But everyone who talks about it, they're just like, I'm not saying the whole thing. Like, that's a stupid title, guys.
So what did you learn?
Peter Wolleben is a German author and forester. This book was originally written in German. It's a little piece of pop science that explores his observations on trees and forests in his work as a forester, which he was a park manager for a giant forest somewhere in Germany. And he's obviously very knowledgeable in the biology and the ecology of trees and forests. But what I like is it's not just about the science. It's also based on his hypotheses and unproven observations. So it's a mix of proven science and hypotheses and just observations that he's had over the years. Like, for example, he talks about how a lot of people talk about how people who are really in tune with nature, you always hear that phrase, right? Mm-hmm. It kind of sounds like pseudoscience, but it's not far from the realm of possibility that we can genuinely feel how a forest feels.
Yep.
Because people who live in nature will tell you, like, this forest feels healthy.
Energetically.
It feels energetic. And then they will go to a dying forest and say, it feels sad, it feels unhealthy. And it's not that crazy to think because there's a lot of evolutionary reasons why we would want to be in tune with our environment. But also, trees do communicate all the time using pheromones and their root systems and chemicals. Like it's really crazy. So honestly, the vibe of this book is like going through a walk in the forest with your kindly old grandpa who knows a lot about trees.
Oh, I love that.
It's also a great book to fall asleep to.
Oh, but not like because it's boring, just because it's lovely?
No, it's not boring. It talks about all sorts of stuff, like the hundreds of different strategies that different trees use, the different ways that trees will pollinate themselves, how they support their families, how different species choose different strategies to survive, like how birch trees choose to grow really, really fast and have this really amazing bark that's fire retardant and like infection proof, but at the cost of never growing to be terribly tall. Whereas like an oak tree will go really, really slow, but incredibly strong. They all have their niches.
This is beautiful. It sounds like you retained so much from it. Is that because of the way that it was written or just because it was so fascinating, unexpectedly fascinating?
It's written, it's going to sound like a complaint, but I really don't mean it that way. It's written for absolutely everyone. And this is something people complain a lot about with pop science.
Yeah.
There's a lot of gatekeeping where they're just like, oh, bruh, this is not real science. Like, I want to hear the facts and the studies. But it's like, no, not everyone's, including myself, ready to digest like a giant tome on the studies and the methodology that these studies use. Like, no, it's really about the observations and what to extrapolate from these studies and these observations. And it's very digestible because of that.
That's brilliant. And especially because, we talk about the how distant or the gap that we feel if we're trying to pick up a topic and it's just written so academically. Like, we're not going to do that, right? I'm not going to do that. But then this is also not the TikTok version of finding out about trees. Because now when we think of digestible, that's what I think of, right? Like quick stints of information.
Like 30 seconds.
30 seconds, please, on trees. But how are you going to get to all that and explain it so beautifully as Jacob just did, unless you read it this way? I also want to bring up for nonfiction again, if you don't mind.
Of course.
The Elephant Whisperer. Lawrence Anthony, Graham Spence are the co-authors of this book. And the reason I want to bring this up is this is another nonfiction that I really enjoyed. And I think it's the halfway, or it's the connector between of what you're saying, Jacob. So like our connection to the natural world, to understanding forests, to understanding what it means to connect as us humans to the natural life, I think can feel very surreal, or as you said, just like it's not a thing.
There's like an insurmountable disconnection.
Yes. Yeah. It's hard to convince people just from saying, yes, of course, there is energy to this forests. There is energy and spirits to forests. But this book, The Elephant Whisperer, makes us connect to the animals, to the game life, to safari, in the sense of like, let's understand how these creatures connect to nature and does it that way. And it's brilliant. It's so well written. It's basically about the man who hosts these rogue elephants, right? These elephants who were adopted because they were going to be eradicated. They were going to be put down. They were too much to handle somewhere else. And
rogue, you mean like too crazy to be in a zoo?
Yeah, in a zoo or in another kind of I'm losing my words. Like what's the? Anyways, to be domesticated. All right, to be taken care of.
To the extent that an elephant can be domesticated.
Yes. And so he takes care of them. He bonds with them. He builds bonds with them, which is a totally different thing because, they came in not trusting him, him having to really take his time step by step, day by day to build a relationship, to build trust. And honestly, like I learned so much from this book, not about elephants, but about the patience that it takes to take animals like this that we just think are, beyond our understanding of connecting with humans in a kind of everyday sense, right? Like we're not connecting with elephants the same way we connect to our pets
not
in
even
North
close,
America. Yeah. But he does that. And through this, we get the explanations and the discoveries that he's having about connecting to animals, connecting to nature, this energetic sense. An example is like they would know when he's coming home. If he's going on a travel 4 to 6 weeks, 8 weeks on, and he's coming back a particular day, it's not that he's informed these elephants when he's coming back, but they know. They will stop showing up when he leaves and start showing up to greet him when he comes back.
Wow.
It was so interesting and gives you, jitters. It gave me jitters, that's for sure. I was like, what is happening? It's just the way that he would explain it. So anyway.
So these last two books, The Hidden Life of Trees and The Elephant Whisperer, I think they sometimes elicit some eye rolls.
Yeah.
People thinking like, oh, these books are for tree-hugging hippies. Like, no. Like,
not at all.
Go into it
seriously
with some level of open-mindedness.
Yeah.
Right?
If you're curious, that's all it really takes. So no one's trying to convince you. Let's take a quick break. We're going to be back with Greg David, communication specialist at AMI. We have rapid fire reviews all ready for him to participate in. Also, we're going to get some good book habit talks with him after the break on AMI Audiobook Review. Welcome back to AMI Audiobook Review, the weekly podcast where we chat all things audiobooks. I'm Ramya Amadin. Jacob Szymanski is also here, and we're welcoming in an avid audiobook listener or avid reader. They have to confess when they get here if they're listening to books or not. But Greg David, who's come on the show before, he's AMI's communication specialist. My goodness.
What do you do here?
What do you do here again? I know, I'm sorry. Because I always wanted to call you our marketing specialist. We just like loop you into everything. Also, he's the guy we pick on when we have holes on the shows. KNR,
Yes.
AR, everything possible. But you are an avid book reader. Have you been listening to a lot of audiobooks lately?
Yeah, it was interesting. We were talking earlier about the fact that it was because of this podcast that I started listening to Audible, because just as a lifelong like fall asleeper to reading
Right.
in the evening type of thing. But yeah, I really do like. I use Audible.com. I'm an Amazon subscriber, so I get that as part of the package. So yeah, I really like it, and I find like podcasts, you have it on in the background while you're puttering around the house. So yeah, I'm definitely a convert.
Okay.
You say in the background, but how much in the background? Are you
Yeah,
actively listening to it? That's always the question, right?
Yeah, and that is a better question, Jacob. Like if depending on the podcast, I'll be listening to a podcast while I'm cleaning the house or getting dinner ready, like kind of those tasks where you don't need to concentrate. But if it is an Audible book and one that I'm really into, I'm definitely like sitting down and not doing anything really that involves my brain, because I need to think. I need to think and really listen. So yeah.
Yeah, that's right. Like you can listen to an audiobook comfortably if you're folding clothes, for example, or just doing some cleaning, but like cooking or something that takes up a bit more brain power, I don't know. I kind of doubt people who say that they can really properly actively listen to an audiobook while doing those things.
I think we want to get into another game because it was so fun last time, and we want to know how well people do. So, no pressure. But, we already said he's the guinea pig. So, Greg, we want to put you through the paces. Jacob, I think you should explain the game.
The game is Rapid Fire Reviews. Greg kindly provided to us 5 books that he's read recently. We'll go through them one by one. Greg has 15 seconds, only 15 seconds to review each book. We'll do all 5, and then at the end, Greg, you'll get to choose one of these books to give a more elaborate review on. Does that make sense to everyone?
Maybe more than one, if you really need to redeem yourself.
Maybe.
Yeah. Ready?
Okay.
All right, Greg, does that make sense to you?
It's never sounded so nervous.
Yeah, it makes sense. I'm all nervous. Gee whiz.
Good.
Let's do it.
That's why we like it. Pressure. Okay, here we go. The first book, Cry Wolf, Inquest into the True Nature of a Predator by Harold R. Johnson.
Yes, so this is from University of Regina Press, and Harold R. Johnson really delves into whether wolves attack humans and whether they do them on purpose, whether they view us as prey. And so it's a deep dive into the relationship between humans and wolves.
Good Lord. All right, next one, The Murder Pit by Mitt Finley.
Yeah, I got this recommendation actually through Red Sale on My Life in Books, and this is one of 3 books by Mick Finley, who follows a detective who in London at the same time as Sherlock Holmes, and he is on the seedy side solving crimes that Sherlock Holmes never would.
Yeah, I noticed you picked up the pace there. Good.
Okay. They just seem a little weird. How Kiss, Cheap Trick, Aerosmith, and Stars remake Rock and Roll by Doug Broad.
Yeah, this is great. Just rereading the history of Kiss and Cheap Trick and Aerosmith was fun, and learning about a band named Stars that, along with those bands in the 70s, reshaped kind of glam metal. It's a fascinating nonfiction read.
What? Beat the timer.
With time to spare.
Excuse
Wow,
me.
that was the best one yet.
Goodness.
All right, Last Man Off by Matt Lewis.
Yeah, so this is the story of an oceanographer. He goes on board a ship off the coast of Antarctica, and it's a true story about the sinking of the ship and how it affected him. And it's a gripping nonfiction book that you got to read.
Now he's just describing on
What a
purpose.
show off.
Oh my God. Okay.
Last one.
Last one. Rogue Heroes by Ben Macintyre.
Yeah, so this is a behind-the-scenes story of the SAS, which is called the Special Air Service. It was formed during the Second World War, and it is a deep dive into what they did throughout Africa during the Second World War. And it's, like you said, by Ben Macintyre.
All right. That was repeat information anyway. It didn't count. Okay. Good job. How do you think you did?
Well, I think I did okay as I was going on. I tend to talk a lot anyway, so this was good to have only 15 seconds.
It's especially a good challenge for you, given that.
Yep.
Yes.
Yep.
All right, so which book would you like to elaborate on?
I'd like to elaborate on Ben Macintyre's book, SAS Rogue Heroes, for a couple of reasons, if that's okay with the two of you.
Of course.
Let's go.
Okay, so Ben Macintyre is known for writing historical stories. He's a multi-million-dollar best-selling author, mainly about spies and spy stories. He wrote a book called Operation Mincemeat, which was about the British and how they created a fake spy agent to throw off the Germans. So they had created this fake spy, and the Germans fell for it, like fake documentation, briefcase on him. All the information they have was fake, but they really wanted to test to how well the Germans were entrenched in what the British were doing with regard to their secrets. And so that was a great book. This one is even better though, because it tells the history of the Special Air Service. This is an authorized wartime history. The SAS actually approved for them to sit down with Ben, share all of their old documents with him, and it tells the story of this special forces group, this unit in the British Army. It was founded in 1941 by this guy named David Sterling, who the story on himself is pretty incredible. He was a really kind of lazy soldier. He came from a really wealthy upbringing and was kind of doing this, joining the army on a lark, and realized that he really should get serious. And so he came up with this idea of the Special Air Service. It was a highly classified group. They were very secretive. The idea was that they went behind enemy lines, and they did this mainly through in Africa. The group is still around today. There are actually 22 Special Air Service regiments in Britain, and their role during the Second World War was to just kind of go behind enemy lines and blow up German airfields. That was the main reason for doing it, was so that the German Luftwaffe weren't able to entrench themselves like they had been to that point in Africa, and really. Just the story of these guys who basically the British were saying, you don't exist to us, and if you're ever caught, we don't know anything about you, like kind of the classic 007, right? And actually there's a lot of thought into the fact that maybe 007 was kind of loosely based around some of these guys and around David Sterling. There are contrasting stories to that, but that's kind of the gist of it. Just that they went behind enemy lines, blew up planes, messed things up for the Germans, and made it harder for them to kind of keep hold in North Africa during the Second World War.
The way you talk about them, it sounds like the modern version of privateers, where privateers were like state-sanctioned pirates, but they were just allowed because they would wreak hell behind enemy lines. And these guys were just out there in Africa blowing up Luftwaffe airfields. Am I understanding that correctly?
Yeah. So they were blowing up the airfield. So they made incendiary bombs, and they would come in the dead of night, and they would plant these incendiary bombs on the planes. And that's part of the story too, is that they had to perfect these bombs so that they didn't go off too early, because too early would be really bad. It wouldn't give you enough of a chance to get away. And they would blow up the fuel depots and just really create havoc.
So when you say behind enemy lines, you really mean there is no backup. They're literally in the middle of the enemy controlled territory. They're just skulking around corners and planting bombs.
Yeah. If something bad happens, we don't know anything about you. The British wouldn't talk about this group. They were so secret. And they would literally drop in by parachute behind enemy lines and wreak havoc in the night. And it was just some really crazy stories. So not only just about what they were doing as a group, but also the people that were part of this group. So David Sterling was the leader of the SAS. But, he had a guy named Paddy Mayne, who was kind of his second in command. And this guy, from all accounts, had a bit of a death wish. He was kind of the guy that would run down the runway, firing at, even though he was outgunned and outmanned, he would be firing right at the Germans as he was running down a runway. The book also digs into his backstory and to David Sterling's backstory. So kind of the two of them are kind of the co-leaders of this group, and goes into how they found all of these other guys. And they were kind of the guys that they got to be part of this team weren't your regularly military dudes. They were a little bit crazy. They were a little bit different. They were a little bit more willing to risk themselves for the cause. And so it really was kind of like a motley crew of guys. And you needed to be that way because you were living off the land. And by the way, the land was a desert. So you were only finding water at oases. You weren't, you had to keep a low profile. And so you didn't have like tents and big camps set up. You were kind of hiding amongst rocks and things like that, and hiding out and planning during the day, and then running your missions at night.
I'm curious if you watched is it a TV show that was made?
Yes.
On this?
Yes. I have watched it, and I actually watched it partway through reading the book, and it didn't ruin the experience for me, but it did. And actually, the book, as both of you know, when you're reading a book, you get a lot more context into these stories. This was a mini series for BBC that I think you can check it out on Amazon. And they had to gloss over a lot of those stories. They also created some characters that weren't there.
Right.
There's a female character in the television show that isn't in the book. And so yeah,
it's
if you want
more historical fiction, if you think.
Yeah, it is. Yeah. It is. And and the other thing is, it bugs me when they make these TV shows is that they'll create a character and then there'll be like a potential love interest. And like, I'm okay with romance, but like, don't create a romantic storyline because you feel like you need to. I think it was, that's how I felt a little bit about this. But at its bare bones, it's a great miniseries as well.
Now, why'd you pick up the series in the middle of reading the book?
Because it was on and my partner wanted to watch it. So she said, I really want to watch this, but I don't want to watch it until you're done reading it. I'm like, all right, you know what? I'm done reading it. I wasn't really done reading it, right. But I said, yeah, let's check it out. And, aside from this story is the story, and the television show is based around Africa, but these guys actually went over to the Pacific Theater as well. So they once they were done their roles in Africa, they moved on to a different theater during the Second World War. And so if there is a second season of the show, and I believe there's going to be, it'll deal with the Pacific Theater for these guys.
I'm curious about when we talk historical reads, doesn't have to be fiction or nonfiction. How much of it do you go back and research about? Like, if all this information, this learning was new for you, Greg, do you go back and research more? Do you deep dive into it post reading the book?
Not post during the book. I'll put the book down and I'll pick up my phone and I will start Googling things because, a lot of times there might be a reference, but not a deep dive into a certain location in Africa or, really kind of understanding, maybe geographically where they were. Like, there are maps that are in the book, but I will head to Google like mid-read on a nonfiction book and really dig deep into the history because I'm fascinated by it all.
So you described the show as being historical fiction, but is the book historical fiction as well? Or is it told in a narrative style? What's the writing like?
Yeah, a great question. So it's all factual. Ben Macintyre was given access to all of the documentation. So this is all factual. There's nothing made up. That's why there's no romance in the book. It really is. It's interesting. Ben Macintyre, even though he's writing a historical book, I'm sure that you both have had experience with books that were historical in nature and were very, very dry. That isn't the case with SAS Rogue Heroes. Because of his writing, it really, really pulled me in immediately. The conversations between these guys, they have like they've got all the reports and everything, so they know this is what they did and what they said. So yeah, it's all factual, and like I said, the way that Ben Macintyre writes it reads like a great novel. Yeah, honestly. Yeah, and you could be, aside from the fact that in the book itself, the paper book, there are photos. There are photos of all of the soldiers and some of the documentation in there. It does read like a novel, even though it's factual.
So why did Ben Macintyre get chosen to have access to the archive and these documents? Like, what's his background? Is he a historian?
Yeah, he is a historian. So first of all, he's a columnist and he's an associate editor at the Times, and has worked as the newspaper's correspondent in New York and Paris and Washington. And I mentioned Operation Mincemeat off the top, so that was Second World War in nature. He also wrote a book called A Spy Among Friends, which is a relationship between a British spy and his handler, and it's also a true story, and has been made into a miniseries that is available to check out as well. I think it is on Netflix. Or it might be Acorn or BritBox, but I've checked that one out as well. And so, Jacob, he's got that background of he's already written about these topics. And so the members of the SAS said, listen, we can trust this guy. Like, he knows how to tell our story. And so we're going to give him access to the folks that were involved if they're still alive, but more importantly, the reams and reams of documents.
I know that you've recommended nonfiction, just across the board. And it seems like in your list of books that we went through for rapid fire reviews, you enjoy this kind of genre and the learning of it. So I'm not going to ask you about that. But I'm curious about, because you said sometimes things come across dry and it's not well written. When have you ever, or when do you give up on a book? Or are you a completionist?
It's so hard. I'm not a completionist. I'll shut it down if I'm not pulled in. Like, I watch a lot of TV, and I'll give a series 3 episodes, and so I'll give a book like 100 pages, 200 pages, and if I'm not engrossed in it, I'm out. And that doesn't matter whether it's nonfiction or fiction. If I'm not pulled in, I've got books and books and books and boxes of books stacked around my house in different locations. So if I'm not pulled in, I'm moving on to the next book.
But, there's also a middle ground where you're not really enjoying a book, but you just complete it over months, right? In multiple sittings.
Oh, how do people do that? How do you go back?
And actually, Jacob, that's a really good point. If I start a book, I'll finish that book before I move on to the next one. I can't have 2 or 3 books kind of all on the go and then say, okay, I'm going to put that one down because I'm not feeling it, and I'm going to go and read that one first. Like, when Stephen King's latest book came out, I dropped everything to read that book and read it over a weekend just because I had to.
Yeah.
But that's the only time I'm not the type of person that can have a whole bunch of different books all kind of scattered around me. I'll start reading it. If I'm into it, I'll keep going. And if I'm not into it, I'll just drop it by the wayside. So I may have just contradicted myself by what I just said, because I am a completionist if I'm into the book or if it's Stephen King.
Those are 2 caveats.
Yeah.
The thing is, though, like, I'm really curious about this kind of mediocre middle ground, like, you're not loving it, but you're not hating it factor. Because if I put down a book with the sense of, meh, I'll pick it up in a bit, maybe I'll be into it later, I promise you there's very rarely a time where I'll pick it up.
That's the thing with those books, is you tell yourself, it's probably going to get better.
Yeah.
Or I hope it's going to get better.
Yeah.
Whereas if you're reading a bad book, if you're reading a bad book, it's like, I don't think this is going to get any better.
Yes. And then you drop it consciously.
Yeah, and it could depend on where you are in your life too. You might just not have been in the mood for that book, right? It's the same thing with, again, going back to a TV show. Just because I watch so much TV, is like, oh, I'll go back to that show. Like Luther, I started to watch Luther and wasn't into it, and it wasn't until it was all done and years later that I went back and watched it and really appreciated it. So I think that you can totally do that with books too. Maybe it wasn't the time in your life to read it. It wasn't appropriate at that point. I also am lucky enough that I have one of the neighborhood free libraries, because I'm sighted. I can read the books that I will go and donate a book down to the community library, or I'll grab a book from there as well and bring that up.
I so want to bring up On Writing with you, which is the Stephen King Guide to Better Writing, or whatever he calls it.
Oh, I know you have mentioned that so many times on this podcast.
I'm like, yes,
Rami and I need to get into it. Yeah, the next time I'm on, we'll talk about On Writing.
Okay, so this is the perfect opportunity to bring it up yet again. Thank you, Greg.
Yeah, the next time I'm on, we'll talk about that one.
Okay, but this time you're on, I want to bring it up in one context, which is we've been asking people, like over the last month, we posed this question to the book club and brought people on to talk about the ranking of elements of a book in order of importance for our pleasure, right? So we're talking about plot, writing, characters, and setting. So you've already talked about little things here and there today's conversation, writing style and et cetera, et cetera. Do you have a general sense of your preference?
Yes, and
go.
Yes, and I listened to that podcast, and I was in on that conversation, and I can't remember who it was. So for me, it's plot. No, character. Character is first for me,
Mm-hmm.
and then plot, and then setting for me is last. And I can't remember which guest mentioned how setting was more important, seemed to be more important as the conversation kind of went on. But for me, it's the characters. If I'm not drawn in and don't care about the characters, then that's the first thing the first instance of disconnect for me.
And that has nothing to do, not nothing to do, but it doesn't override, it isn't overridden by writing style. I mean, like, let's face it, you do a lot of writing in your own life. You're interested in writing as a kind of like topic or subject. So is it the way that characters are written that make it more appealing? Or is it just that, hey, this is a book, we're not really talking about writing?
For me, am I connecting emotionally with that character, and do I care about what's going to happen to them throughout the book? And now I'm talking specifically about a fiction book, and I'm sorry for the people that don't like Stephen King, because I've got to go back to him. There's a book that Stephen King wrote called The Tommyknockers, and it's about a woman who she unearths a UFO that has crashed on her property, and it didn't matter. It's one of my least favorite books, and it's because of the lead character. And for me, it's not about that I didn't care about her. It was more like Stephen King, I think in a way, did a disservice to the character and somehow made her unlikable to me when I was reading her, because there have been many, many female characters in his other books that I absolutely love, and his most recent Holly is one of them. But the Tommyknockers, for me, there was just a disconnect, and it was a slog for me. And so to me, it's the character that's got to pull me in, and once I care about them, you've got me all in for the rest of the book.
Now, you say unlikable. Unlikable how? In the sense that they're not an interesting character, or they're not a good person? Like, what was the distinction
great question.
there?
Yeah, that's great, and it's good. I should make that distinction. If she was unlikable because I didn't care what she was doing. I didn't care what she said.
You weren't invested.
Oh, you know what it is, Jacob? Actually, now that you make me think about that, it was her language pattern I didn't like. The way that she spent time, she was basically living alone, and her only companion was her pet dog. And so there were the conversations that she was having with her pet dog just didn't ring true for me. Some of the terminology that she... No, not at all. No, don't say that. Don't say that. No, not at all. It was just, I didn't like the cutesy language that she was using. She lived in the middle of nowhere in Maine, so I felt like there was a little bit of too much attention paid to slang terminology, to like Maineism, exactly, Jacob. And so that's what it was that made her the character unlikable to me.
So it sounds like it had more to do with the writing than anything.
But the writing of that character.
Yeah, the writing of that character specifically.
Yeah.
Just a bit of a grind to read anytime she's on the page, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And that was a time where I can remember just kind of hate reading it. I was just like, all right, I'm just going to push through because it's Stephen King and he usually does me good, and it's got UFOs in it, and I like UFOs. And I've never gone back to read that one.
So you put plot second, and I think plot was a contentious element. I think some people had it last, and some people, like myself, had it first. You had it second. Why is that?
Because then once I like the character, then take me on the journey, and that's kind of what I think about when I think of plot. What's the adventure that you're going to take me on for this character? So that's why I rank that second. Is that now you got me. So now take me on an adventure that I'm going to enjoy being or not enjoy being on.
Right. I like the way you put that. It's about going on a journey. It's the difference between going to the park and laying down a blanket and taking a nap and going a walk or going on a walk.
What's wrong with that? We want to also lay down on blankets in the park with Addie LaRue, okay? It's fine.
Oh, you can do that. I'll go for a walk and talk to people.
Okay, all right.
Talk to people? Wow.
Nobody wants to do that.
No way.
Oh, man. I also wanted to ask you, just for fun, do you do anything... What do you usually do when you're listening to audiobooks? You talked earlier about background listening and such, and we wanted to find out if you do anything interesting or just usual.
Yeah, so it's usually like a mindless chore. Jacob mentioned folding laundry, so it'll be that. It could be something like a DIY, like painting the house. Doing something where you don't have to worry about the minutia. Like obviously cutting with a sharp knife, I probably want to be focusing on that rather than. But so it'll be those kind of tasks where you don't have to worry about what you're doing. Also driving a long distance. If I'm driving from where I live to Toronto for work or whatever, then an audiobook is fantastic for that.
Very popular.
Planes. Back when I used to fly in a plane, you could put a book on while you're doing that. So yeah, those would be the scenarios that I would be using Audible for.
Is it a skill to be able to handle a knife while listening to an audiobook?
Yeah, I do that all the time.
I was gonna say.
So for me, if I want to be able to concentrate, like usually what I'm doing in that case then is I'm referencing a recipe. And I want to, if it's,
so
like if I'm just like if I'm just prepping like roasted vegetables or something for dinner, then I can do that with the book on. But, and you know what, actually the other thing that I wanted to mention as I'm talking about listening to audiobooks is I'll listen to a podcast with my earbuds in, but I'll listen to an audiobook with a speaker, smart speaker.
Why is that?
Yeah. Like so that it's in the room or in the car.
Is it easier to focus that way?
I feel like you're making me analyze this a little bit. And I think that is the reason why. Like, it's almost like a teacher reading to you.
You know what?
When you're in elementary school.
Yes, it's story time. But also, like, you're an avid TV watcher. And that includes the visual focus, right? So to kind of go from that to just audio might be harder than we realize.
Right. Do you struggle with, like, paying attention since you're always getting that visual stimuli?
No. I'm excited people on the show.
I'm pretty good at multitasking. I'm still old school where I actually put my phone down when I'm watching TV.
Wow.
If I do find myself reaching for the phone, it probably means I'm bored with whatever it is that I'm watching.
Jeez, he's so conscious.
I know people who will exclusively watch TV with two screens. Like they cannot sit down and watch.
2 screens?
Well, I mean like your phone and the TV.
Yeah.
Right? They're just browsing Reddit
like
or checking
both.
Twitter.
Yes, yeah.
Yeah, you're doing both. Like people just can't do it anymore.
Yeah, I mean, I'm old school. Like that I mentioned, I'm 52. So like I grew up where you only had one screen, guys, and you had to get up and change the channel on that one screen.
But now we have 2. You just refuse. You don't want to change.
One more question for you, David.
Or Greg.
See, this is confusing when you have 2 first names, okay?
Believe me, as I mentioned, I'm 52. I've been called both all my life. Don't worry about it. I just knew I had to.
Jacob's been calling you Dave since the beginning.
All right, David Greg, what are your thoughts on playback speed for your audiobooks? Any thoughts?
Oh, yeah. I hear you talk about this all the time. I can't speed it up. No. Sorry.
Not even 1.1?
No. I can't even do it for podcasts. It's got to be the speed it is.
But most of us agree that podcast is a whole different thing. Do you ever feel you're putting down a book because it's too slow? Because of the pacing of the reading, of the performance?
No. The only time that, either I'm just not interested in it, like we mentioned before. Also, sometimes the topic is so dense that maybe I do have to put it down. I was just months ago, I was reading a book on the history of the Gulag. If you ever want to find out about the history of the Gulag, I can recommend the book, but it's heavy reading. And so I had to take some breaks just from that book just because of the subject matter.
Wow. All right. Greg, you're the best. Thank you.
Thank you.
We love talking books with you. Greg's going to come back at the end of the month on KR, Kelly and Ramya, because we're going to talk about Holly by Stephen King. That's the recommendation of the month. And that's it for us. We're wrapping up the show now. We'll be back next week. We're talking to Dave Brown. We have an actual review as well. Jacob and I are busy reading this recommendation by Dave. Yeah, Dave recommended Success by Martin Amis. It's been an interesting read, to say the least. How far along are you, Rams? A quarter. A quarter? I'm finding it to be a struggle. Like I had to put down a lot of my own perspectives to get into this book. Oh yeah, we'll get into it. It's challenging. It's very challenging. But Martin Amis is one of his favorite authors, he says. So
Yeah, interesting pick, Dave.
Yeah.
Interesting.
very interesting. We literally can't say anything more without talking about the book. And I think we're also chatting with Amir Khan, our audiobook worm. So lots of conversations next week. But until then, enjoy your week and happy audiobook listening.